Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Hi there.
Today, we're getting into a really interesting snapshot of what's happening in Dutch politics right now.
Yeah, lots going on. Our source is a YouTube podcast, A Hammeren from De Telegraaf.
Right, and they had this lively chat, two commentators basically dissecting the latest news.
Exactly, and listener questions too. So our mission here is to pull out the key insights for you, what's really going on behind the headlines.
We're covering quite a bit Peter Omtzigt's departure, which is huge news.
Mm-hmm. Then there's how parties handle the media, some voter feelings about the PBB.
That whole F-selling thing, tensions over Israel policy, even a smoke bomb incident.
Yeah, it's a packed agenda. So what are the real takeaways? Let's get into it.
Okay, first up, Peter Omtzigt. He's announced he's leaving Parliament next Tuesday, farewell letter on Wednesday. Feels pretty major.
It absolutely does. And the F. Hammeren discussion, they brought up something quite fascinating, though, maybe a long shot.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
Well, they pointed out, theoretically, if this cabinet hangs on for another, say, 2 years, and some NSC members leave.
NSC, that's his party, New Social Contract.
Right. The Electoral Council, the body overseeing elections, could actually contact Omtzigt.
Seriously?
Yeah, and there's even this scenario where maybe someone steps aside for him, potentially letting him come back as party leader. It's all very what if, but interesting.
Wow. Okay. But what about his actual next steps? People are guessing, right?
They are. The European Court of Auditors got a mention. Or maybe, like he sort of suggested himself, just taking time off for his family, which after 21 years as an MP, you can understand.
Definitely. And his farewell message. What are they expecting?
The feeling on the podcast was it might echo that farewell video he did before, reflecting on his long stint in The Hague.
21 years is a long time.
It really is. And they speculated he might, use it to address some unresolved issues with politicians, journalists, civil servants, maybe even past cabinets or prime ministers. Could be quite revealing about the system.
Sounds like one to watch. And the reactions now to him leaving, what's the vibe?
A real mix, according to the source. Some reactions felt a bit like crocodile tears,
For show.
Maybe. While others were noticeably quiet, especially perhaps in some CDA circles, his old party, where maybe some felt he should have gone earlier.
Right. And does this rock the coalition's boat? I mean, usually a key figure leaving isn't great news.
Historically, no, it hasn't been positive. But the Farmerin take was that this coalition was already dealing with quite a bit of turbulence. So maybe the impact this time won't be quite as destabilizing as it might have been in the past. We'll see.
Okay, let's shift a bit. There was a listener question about how professional different parties are when dealing with the press. That's interesting.
Yeah, it is. And the VVD often comes up as being pretty smooth operators.
Why is that, do you think? According to the source, I mean.
Well, the analysis pointed to their long history, basically. They've got established structures, tons of experience in government. It just helps them present a more polished front, generally.
Makes sense.
But they also noted other established parties like CDA and D66, they tend to have pretty stable communication, too. It seems like longevity and a solid internal setup really matter.
So the newer parties, that's where the problems creep in.
Often, yeah. The podcast mentioned NSC, for example, just facing those, growing pains. Less developed structures, still figuring things out.
Right.
And they mentioned PVDA Groenlinks having some initial strategic communication hurdles after they merged their lists. It really highlights something, doesn't it? How vital a good comms team is.
Absolutely. And they had that anecdote about Team Samson, right? The former PVDA leader.
Yes. That was fascinating, how that team apparently boosted his image and poll numbers significantly. They focused on an honest story, accessibility.
And didn't they say even admitting mistakes sometimes and putting him in a suit?
Exactly. The suit thing, too. It was all part of crafting this image. And interestingly, when that core team broke up, the party's fortunes seemed to dip. It really shows the power of focused communication.
Amazing what a good strategy can do. But they also mentioned a less successful story, VNL's early days.
Ah, yes. Vin Claveren, Bontis, Dreisen trying to team up with Bram Moscovich. The fact Bontis didn't even show up for the announcement.
Not a great sign.
No. It basically screamed internal problems from day one. Shows that even with experienced people, if you're not aligned, it can just fall apart.
And that led to a point about politicians needing to filter their emotions, right? Before speaking publicly.
Precisely. They brought up Timur Franz on election night. Remember when he was asked about the result?
Vaguely, yeah. He was a bit dismissive.
Yeah, saying he'd leave the analysis to the debtors, the commentators. It didn't play very well, suggesting he wasn't really engaging with the loss.
Not great optics.
No. It just underscores how important it is to manage that emotional reaction, especially when things are tough. Projecting accountability matters.
Okay, let's switch tracks again. There's this idea mentioned in the podcast that some right-wing voters might be a bit disappointed with the PVV, feeling they aren't delivering a purely conservative agenda.
Yeah, it's nuanced, though, because conservative can mean different things, right?
Sure.
The discussion pointed out that parties like SGP, very focused on Christian values, or CDA, maybe even JA21, might align better with very traditional conservative views.
And fiscal conservatism, is that changing?
Well, the point was made that more parties seem focused on budget discipline now. It's less unique territory. They also talked about the Netherlands historically being super strict on EU budget rules.
Rooms are down to Paul, more Catholic than the Pope.
Exactly that phrase. And the idea that maybe that's shifting towards more flexibility like other EU countries.
But where does the PVV maybe diverge from traditional conservatism, according to the source?
Foreign policy seemed to be a key area mentioned. Things like Ukraine support, NATO, U.S. relations, Wilder's stance wanting to keep tanks here, being cautious on Ukraine aid that might not sit well with more traditional interventionist conservative views.
Interesting. So could voters shift? Are alternatives like JA21 gaining ground?
The analysis suggested SGP has its loyal base, but it's limited. J21 with Joost Eertmans could attract PVV voters unhappy, particularly about migration policy, feeling the PVV isn't tough enough.
But JA21 needs more than just migration.
Seems so. They probably need a broader platform for wider appeal. And, the general instability of the cabinet could also play a role. Some disappointed PVV voters might just not vote next time.
Right. Okay, another source of friction is real policy within the cabinet.
Yeah.
What's the core issue there?
It seems to boil down to communication, or the lack of it. Minister Veldkamp sent that critical letter about aid to Gaza.
And that annoyed the PVV.
Apparently so. The key question raised on Afhamern was, were the PVV ministers properly informed beforehand? Well, Minister Kleber, she handles foreign trade and development cooperation. She said she was informed, but would have preferred to be involved.
Ah, that distinction again. Informed versus involved tells a story.
It really does. It highlights that classic tension. Individual ministers' responsibility versus needing the whole cabinet on board, especially on sensitive stuff like this.
And then Walters jumps on Twitter.
Predictably, yeah. Showing a very different stance on Israel than other coalition partners. And the podcast noted how his tweets instantly create this media frenzy, speculating about the cabinet falling.
But does it ever really lead to a crisis? Or is it just noise?
The feeling from the discussion was, maybe it's becoming a pattern. Strong reactions from Wilders, but not always major consequences for the coalition itself.
So his leverage might be decreasing. Except maybe on asylum.
That was the suggestion. And also, realistically, would a cabinet collapse over Israel policy resonate much with the general public? Probably not. It's not like, say, a major economic crisis.
And there was something about difficulty reaching PVV people for comment.
Yeah, they mentioned trying to contact a PVV MP involved in foreign affairs who was unavailable. It hints at maybe some communication blockages or challenges within the PVV on certain issues.
And Veldkamp's timing with the letter, was that strategic?
Possibly. The suggestion was it might have been a move to present everyone with a done deal, maybe aligning with a wider feeling in Parliament wanting a tougher line on Gaza aid.
How's Prime Minister Scoof handling all this? He seems caught in the middle.
He really does. His appearance on NOS Stories, where Israel-Palestine was a big topic, was mentioned. The observers noted his demeanor, the clear challenges to his authority.
Like Walter's tweets.
Exactly. And the underlying lack of trust, maybe, between the coalition leaders after those long, difficult negotiations. It's a tough gig.
But is he likely to quit?
The consensus seemed to be probably not yet. He'll likely stick it out, at least until the NATO summit. A sense of duty, despite the frustrations.
Okay, let's talk about that F-selling trip controversy. A planned day out for asylum seekers that caused a massive backlash.
Yeah, that really blew up. The trip was organized by the COA, the Asylum Seekers Agency, apparently to ease tensions after an incident nearby.
But it didn't go down well.
Not at all. Huge criticism, especially from Minister Faber, the PVV Minister for Asylum, and that public sentiment of why them and not us really took hold.
The podcast discussed the minister's authority here. Right?
Yes. The basic principle is The minister sets the policy, sets expectations for agencies like COA. That's her job.
But her approach was criticized, using Twitter and all that.
Right. The critique was that her public attacks might actually create conflict with the agency she's responsible for and maybe deflect from her own role in setting the overall policy direction.
And then people started fundraising for alternative trips.
Yeah, that was the counter-reaction. Citizens organizing things themselves. It was quite something.
But the bigger question hanging over this, according to Ephemerin, is about actual policy change, isn't it? Is the government really getting stricter on asylum? Or is it just these symbolic rows?
That's exactly the point they hammered home. Is the focus on these red meat controversies masking a lack of real legislative progress on asylum?
Because if the minister keeps expressing outrage, but nothing fundamentally changes.
Then public trust could eventually erode. People might start asking, okay, but what are you actually doing?
Yeah, fair point. Now, poor Prime Minister Scoof seems to have faced other issues undermining his authority, too.
Sadly, yes. The podcast mentioned those really unpleasant incidents on Remembrance Day and Liberation Day, people turning their backs.
That's awful.
Yeah. And the Breckelmans incident where Marco Kroon got involved. Plus, that smoke bomb during the Polish PM's visit, internationally embarrassing, and raised questions about security.
Not a good look.
Definitely not. They made efforts to stress it wasn't typical of Dutch-Polish relations, highlighting shared history. One host even mentioned their grandmother marrying a Polish soldier who helped liberate Breda.
And a nice personal touch to underline the connection.
Yeah. But these incidents cumulatively don't help the PM's image.
The discussion also covered demonstrations and the justice minister's role. What was the concern there?
It's this growing feeling, perhaps, that the right to protest is sometimes treated as absolute, even when laws are broken, like blocking highways or riots.
And the government response.
Criticism was voiced that the justice minister often condemns things as unacceptable, but then what? Is there effective action? Are arrests made consistently?
So again, the gap between words and action.
Exactly, that recurring theme. Expressing outrage is one thing, but if it's not backed by tangible consequences, does it lose its impact? Does it damage trust further?
Looking ahead then, what's coming up politically? Anything specific highlighted?
Yeah, well, the pension debate continues. But the really sensitive issue flagged in the Ephemerin discussion was rent control. Specifically, the housing corporations pushing back hard against the rent freeze proposed in the spring budget.
Why are they so opposed?
They argue it breaks previous agreements and, crucially, will mean billions less for building and renovating social housing. Billions.
Wow. So what are they doing?
They're taking legal action against the housing minister, De Jonge.
Seriously? Suing the government?
Yep. And if the court sides with them, that puts the coalition in a really tight spot, especially the PVV, who've championed this rent freeze, the Boodschappen bonus, they called it.
A bonus for groceries, essentially.
Right. So a court ruling against it could force them to completely rethink a major part of their plan. It could get very tricky.
It really sounds like a tangled web of issues. This deep dive into the Ephemerin chat has been incredibly insightful, thanks.
It really has. You see how interconnected everything is? Coalition dynamics, public opinion, communication strategies. It's complex.
Definitely gives you a clearer picture of the pressures and challenges in Dutch politics right now.
Absolutely. And it makes you reflect on how coalition governments actually function day to day, doesn't it? Especially with such different partners. There's obviously so much more to dig into on specific policies, asylum, housing, foreign relations.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it's giving you, the listener, a better handle on these dynamics.
Indeed, and maybe it leaves you thinking about this. In politics today, with all the noise and spin, how do you best figure out the real difference between what politicians say they'll do and what actually gets done? Something to ponder.